Good morning, everyone. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning. Memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamis Rabinowitz, Shalamis Bas Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. And this week's learning has been sponsored by Richard Goldstein in memory of his father, Mr. Joseph Goldstein, Zalman ben Yosef. Okay, we are in Mishna Chala, Perek Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishna Beis, Mishna 2. And yesterday's Mishnah, the first Mishnah, Maseches Chala, was focusing on the 5 grains, about how the laws of the Torah that apply to the 5 grains specifically. And now Mishnah Beis continues with that. If you eat a volume of an olive of matzah on Pesach, made from any of these 5 grains, you have fulfilled your obligation of eating mitzvah on the night of Pesach. The Mishnah mentions the kazayis volume of an olive because that's the minimum amount that one needs to eat to fulfill the mitzvah. But to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah, the matzah has to be made from flour of any of these 5 grains. If it's not any of these 5 grains, if it's corn, or if it's rice, or if it's millet, you would not fulfill your mitzvah. Now, Mishnah continues, kazayis chametz chaya bikares. If you eat a kazayis, the volume of an olive of chametz, chametz is where you have the flour and the water are sitting together for 18 minutes, or whatever time it takes for them to ferment. Chametz is a grain that was allowed to ferment. It's called leavening when it comes into contact with water. One is not permitted to eat chametz on Pesach. One who intentionally eats chametz on Pesach is liable to the punishment of karis, of death by heaven. And only a person who eats a kazayis of chametz of the 5 grains would be liable to this punishment of karis. The prohibition of eating chametz on Pesach only applies to chametz that it was made from any of these 5 grains. These 5 grains, again, when they ferment, again, by sitting with liquid or being heated up with liquid, the chemical process that takes place, such as the rising of the dough, is called leavening, is called chametz. If you do that to rice flour or millet flour, corn flour, there is a chemical process that takes place, but it's not the same thing as the process takes place by chametz, by the 5 grains. It's called, the process takes place by other types of species of grain is not called leavening, it's called spoilage. That's the term that's used. But the point is, it's not chametz. And therefore, if you eat on them on Pesach, there's no punishment of kares. Eating rice on Pesach, Ashkenazic Jews do not eat rice on Pesach. Sephardic Jews do eat rice on Pesach. That has to do with a different custom that came about many, many years later after the Torah was given and after the Talmud. But the point is that when it comes to the Torah's prohibition and the punishment of kares for intentionally eating chametz, it only applies to chametz, meaning chametz only is from the 5 grains that we mentioned before, not from other species of grain. Now let's say you have a kazayis of chametz that got mixed with other types of food. You have transgressed on Pesach the ownership of chametz. There's a prohibition to eat chametz, which if you intentionally carries a punishment of kares. There's a prohibition to have chametz in your possession that does not carry a kares punishment, but it's a transgression of a Torah prohibition. And that Torah prohibition, again, only applies to possession of chametz of these 5 grains. The example used of the Mishnah is when it got mixed into other species, because the prohibition of owning chametz doesn't just apply to owning chametz itself, but if the chametz gets mixed in to other foods, depending on the ratio of chametz to the food, you could still have a prohibition of possessing chametz, even though it got mixed into other foods. The point is that all these laws of Pesach only apply to the chametz, to the fermented grain that comes from the 5 species mentioned before: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Now the Mishnah turns to a different halacha that applies, again, only to the 5 grains. And it's talking about person who makes a vow. A neder means that I can take something permissible and I can forbid it upon myself. So I can forbid it upon myself, and that applies by anything. But here, the case of the Mishnah is that when the person makes the neder, the person is hanoidrim and hapasim and atfua. He says that he's making a vow forbidding pas, which means bread, or grain. That's the wording. Pas is the Mishnaic word. Tavua is the Mishnaic word. These are Hebrew words. At least tavua is. Tavua is grain is at least. Maybe pas Aramaic. I'm not sure. Excuse me. But the point is that if he uses the word that represent that people use to say bread or to say grain, aser behem. If this grain is the 5, if we're talking about so what becomes forbidden on this person who makes this vow? Well, if he made the vow from bread, it means bread made from the 5 grains. If he made the vow from tavua, which means grain, then again it includes these 5 grains. If the bread was made out of rice, or if the other grains, such as rice, would not be included in this vow. The reason is because vows follow the way people speak, how people use their words and their terminologies and their terms. So when a person says pas, bread, they mean bread made out of these 5 grains. Now, assuming that these grains are used in that place to make bread, when a person says bread, it means whatever of those 5 grains that are used in that place to make bread from. But if even in a place where people make rice bread or cornbread, they don't call it bread. They call it rice bread. They call it cornbread, which I think is very typical even nowadays. And therefore, if you just use the word bread, the connotation is bread made out of the 5 grains. Again, depending on if it's a place where they use all 5 grains. If it's a place they only use wheat, it would only apply to wheat because they just don't make barley bread. We don't make barley bread. So bread would mean wheat bread. But anything outside of the 5 grains would for sure not be included, because when you just use the word bread, then it only means bread made out of one of the 5 species, and that's the only thing that's forbidden. Cornbread doesn't become forbidden. The same thing when you use the word tavua, grain. Grain, the word grain itself, when people use the word grain, they mean any of the 5 grains. And therefore, when the vow is from grain, those 5 grains become forbidden. Other grains, other things would not become forbidden. Now, the Mishnah continues like this. So this was the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as it says, Divrei Rabbi Meir. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say, "Hanoidem and hadagan eino aser ela mehen." If you make a vow from dagan, okay, the word is dagan. That's another word that's used for grain, but it's the word dagan itself means something that's piled up. Now, grain is piled, but instead of using the word grain, use the word dagan, which again, the root of it means something that's piled up. So the Chachamim say, if your vow is from dagan, that's the word that you used. So the Chachamim say the only thing that again becomes forbidden for you is the 5 species mentioned before. Now, Reb Meir never, in the text of our Mishnah, Reb Meir never mentioned anything about the word dagan. But from the fact that Chachamim introduce dagan, that means to say that the Chachamim were adding to what Reb Meir said. Reb Meir said, if you say tavua grain, then it's the 5 species and not others. The Chachamim say dagan also is only from the 5 species. That means, according to Reb Meir, if you use the word dagan, it would include more. It would include anything that's piled up. Beans are piled up. Rice is piled. Different types of seeds are piled. So according to Reb Meir, the word dagan, according to Reb Meir, when people say the word dagan, they mean to include more than the grains of the 5 species. They mean to include anything that's piled up, which is the source of that word dagan. And the Chachamim say no. People typically, when they use the word dagan, it's interchangeable with the word tavua, and therefore it will only include the 5 grains. Then the Mishnah concludes, "V'chayavin v'chalo uv'maisris," And when we talk about the 5 grains will have an obligation of both challah and maasros. Challah, separating from a dough, will apply to them, and the maasros and the tithings, the maasros, truma, maaser that we've been discussing until now. They all apply to the 5 grains. The point of the Mishnah is by the 5 grains you will have both obligations together. By the 5 grains, you will have by these 5 grains, you will have an obligation of challah and maaser. There are times where you may not, but the 5 grains are the only grains that you could actually have both obligations. The next Mishnayos are going to talk about other examples of where only one applies and not the other. Okay, we are continuing with the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chavetz Chaim, Klal Ches, chapter 8, Sif Dalet, paragraph Dalet. V'da de'isa sipur Lashon Harahu afilo al am haaretz. Know that the prohibition of speaking Lashon Harah is even on an ignorant person, even on an unlearned person. Kigam hu b'chlal am Hashem etzivaisav, shetzim mitzrayim. Because he's a Jew. He's part of the Jewish people, the nation of Hashem, that Hashem took out of Egypt. So he may be ignorant, but he's still a child of Hashem. He's still from Hashem's family, Hashem's children. V'chol shekain imhu talmid chacham, and all the more so if the person he's speaking Lashon Hara about is a Torah scholar. B'vadei mesaper Lashon Hara alav avayne gadol harbe yoser. When he speaks Lashon Hara about a Torah scholar, his sin is greater. Okay. V'kama pa'amim nichnas al yedei zeh b'chlal mevaza talmid chacham. And there are many times where what you're saying about this Torah scholar could actually go to the point of what's called mevasa talmid chacham, disgracing a Torah scholar. And the prohibition and the punishment for one who disgraces a Torah scholar is very great. So the Chavetz Chaim says, but our inclination tries to persuade us in the following way. This whole concept of the severity of one who disgraces a Torah scholar only applies to the scholars of the times of the Talmud. They were truly, truly great Torah scholars. But not about what we call a Torah scholar nowadays. They don't come near the scholars of the Talmud, which is true. That's something that we know, that scholars of the Talmud were way above any of the scholars that we have for the past many years. And therefore, the Yetzer Hara says, well, you have to be on the level of the Talmud Chacham, of the Talmud, to fall into the category of disgracing the Talmud Chacham with the severity that entails. V'hutai is gomer. Says the Chavetz Chaim, that is an absolute mistake. The chol Talmud Chacham hu lafi adar. A Talmud Chacham depends on the generation. Filu bizmanenu, and even in our times, which the Chavetz Chaim is trying to say that we the Talmud Chachamim of his generation were not like even the ones from the previous generation. This is something that we typically we know that. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't recognize the Torah scholars of our times. If he's somebody who is able to teach and to answer halachic questions, and he has toiled in Torah study, that's his, and then he's toiled in Torah study, and he has toiled in Torah study and has the ability to render halachic decisions. Nikra Talmid Chacham, that person is called a Torah scholar, Talmid Chacham. One who then disgraces him just with words, even not in front of him. This is a very serious sin, and one could be liable for excommunication for doing so. And all the more so if you're talking about the Talmid Chacham, who is the rabbi, who is the halachic guide of the city. Because then disgracing him is even more serious. Besides for the fact that you have to treat him respectfully, because look, if he's the rabbi of the community, right, and you rely on his decisions, how can you put him down? How can you disgrace him? You rely on him for his decisions. So that makes no sense for you to do that. But by now speaking badly about him, you will cause others not to serve Hashem properly. Because by hearing how you disgrace him, how you put him down, they're going to say, the other people are going to say, excuse me. Why should we go and speak to him and inquire by him? I'm sorry. Any kind of dispute in Jewish law that we may have between us. Meaning that he can't settle it. Meaning if you put him down, then people are going to say, he must not be such a Torah scholar. Why should we bother asking our questions to him? Why should we bother going for our disputes for him to settle it? Because of this, every person now builds his own altar. That's a saying about the fact there's a prohibition for a person to build their own altar to offer sacrifices. So that's used figurative to say that if a person now decides to make up, a halakha decision on his own, it's called he's building an altar for himself. And that's going to be the danger that comes that if you, again, disgrace a Torah scholar who is the rabbi of the city, you're going to be causing other people not to follow what Hashem wants from them because they're not going to ask their questions to him and they're going to make their own decisions, and that can be disastrous. So therefore, when it comes to speaking Lashon, again, it's about anyone, and all the more so if it's a Torah scholar, and all the more so if it's a Torah scholar that is the rabbi of the city. Have a wonderful Shabbos.